80,000 dead on one side of the field, 400 on the other. That is the ledger the Roman historian Tacitus wrote down for a single afternoon in Britain in the year 61 ADA, and even if his numbers are swollen, and they almost certainly are, nobody disputes the shape of what he was describing. One of the most lopsided slaughters in the history of organized warfare, inflicted by the smaller army on the larger one. The field sat somewhere along a Roman military road, the later English would call Watling Street, the great diagonal highway running from the Kent coast up through London toward the northwest of the province. On one end of that field, drawn up in a narrow valley with dense woodland sealing the ground behind them, stood roughly 10,000 Roman soldiers. On the other end, filling the open plain until it disappeared, stood the largest army the island of Britain had ever assembled. One Roman account, from the historian Cassius Dio, puts it at 230,000 people. Modern historians treat that figure with suspicion, but even the skeptical estimates leave the Romans outnumbered many times over, and the Britons themselves clearly believe the day was already decided. We know this because of what they did with their families. They brought them. Thousands of wagons were drawn up in a great arc at the rear of the British host, loaded with wives and children, positioned like grandstand seating so that the households of the warriors could watch Rome die in Britain. Commanding the 10,000 was the provincial governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a hard, methodical soldier who had spent the previous weeks watching this rebellion burn 3 Roman cities to the ground, who had already abandoned London to its fate rather than defend it, and who had chosen this specific valley with the cold deliberation of an engineer selecting a foundation. So the question this episode exists to answer is a simple one. How does a general give away every advantage of numbers, momentum, and morale, and then, in the space of a few hours, convert that position into near total annihilation of the enemy? The answer is not courage. Roman writers loved courage, but courage was present on both sides of that field. The answer is geometry. Suetonius did not win the Battle of Watling Street so much as he designed it, and the design is what we are going to take apart, piece by piece. Here is what the next 25 minutes will give you. First, the legal document that started the entire war, a dead king's will, and the client kingdom arrangement that Rome tore up within weeks of his death. Second, the reason the governor of Britain was 250 miles away on a Welsh island, destroying a Druid sanctuary at the precise moment the east of his province rose in revolt, and why that accident of timing shaped everything that followed. Third, the exact anatomy of the ground Suetonius chose, a narrowing defile with forest at his back, and why that single terrain decision canceled out a numerical advantage of perhaps 20-1. Fourth, the matter of the 2 swords, why the short Roman gladius, a blade of roughly 2 feet, systematically destroyed the long, slashing swords of the Celtic warrior in this specific kind of fight, when in other fights it might not have. And fifth, the decision the Britons made before a single javelin flew, the placement of those wagons, which transformed an ordinary defeat into a massacre from which the rebellion could never recover. Along the way, there are 2 loose threads I want you to hold on to. There was a full Roman legion within marching distance of this battle that never showed up, and its commanding officer's story ends in a way you will not expect, and the victorious general himself, the man who saved Roman Britain, would be quietly removed from his command within about a year of winning. Both of those threads get pulled before we finish. A brief word on evidence, because this channel takes it seriously. Nearly everything narrative we have about this campaign comes down from 2 sources. Tacitus, writing decades later in the 14th book of his Annals, is the closer of the 2, and he had a channel to the events most ancient historians could only dream of, because his own father-in-law, the future governor Agricola, was serving in Britain as a young staff officer during the revolt, quite possibly on Suetonius' own staff at the battle itself. Cassius Dio, writing about 150 years after that, adds detail Tacitus omits, including our only physical description of Boudica, but he's working at a long remove. And a 2021 study of how these accounts have been transmitted and read reminds us that ancient battlefield descriptions are literature as well as record. But the destruction itself is not literary. It survives in the ground, as we will see, in a layer of burned red clay under modern London. Start with the will. In the east of Britain, in what is now Norfolk, lived the Iceni, and their king was a man named Tacitus. To understand his position, back up 18 years. Rome had invaded Britain in the year 43 under the Emperor Claudius, and the Iceni had not fought the invasion. They had cut a deal instead, and even when they briefly rose in 47 after a heavy-handed Roman attempt to disarm the tribes, the arrangement survived because Prasutagus had made his peace with Rome under an arrangement the Romans used to cross their frontier, the Client Kingdom. A 2014 study of client kingship in Roman Britain lays out how the deal worked. The king kept his throne, his lands, and the outward dignity of rule. In exchange, he accepted Roman oversight, Roman loans, and the understanding that his kingdom's long-term future belonged to the empire. It was, in effect, a lease on independence, and everyone involved understood the lease had an end date, and the loans were not a footnote. Dio reports that the philosopher Seneca, the Emperor Nero's own tutor, had pushed 40 million sesterces in loans onto the leading Britons at interest, and then, sensing trouble, called the whole sum in at once. Whether or not Seneca's agents lit the fuse personally, the picture is consistent. The British elite of the East was leveraged to Roman creditors, and the creditors were losing patience. Prasutagus tried to soften that end date with paperwork. When he died around the year 60, his will divided his estate, half to the Roman Emperor Nero, half to his two daughters. It was a careful, lawyerly attempt to buy his family a protected future by giving Rome an enormous cut up front. Rome did not honor it. The man whose office set the tone was the provincial procurator, Tacitus Decianus, the chief financial officer of Britain, a man whose job was extraction and who performed it like a bailiff executing a foreclosure. His agents and the slaves of Roman officials moved into Iceni territory and treated the kingdom not as an inheritance to be divided, but as property to be seized. Estates were confiscated. Iceni nobles were stripped of their lands and, Tacitus says, treated like prisoners of war, and then came the act that turned an administrative outrage into a war. The dead king's widow, a woman named Boudica, was publicly flogged, and her two daughters, the named heirs in the will, were assaulted. Tacitus reports this without flinching, and it is worth sitting with what it meant. Rome had not merely broken a contract. It had ritually humiliated a royal house in front of its own people, and in doing so it handed the tribes of eastern Britain something they had never had before, a single shared grievance in a single leader. Dio gives us the leader as his sources imagined her. Unusually tall, a mass of tawny hair falling below her waist, a great golden torque at her neck, a voice that carried across an assembly. Allow for the Roman appetite for the exotic barbarian queen, and what remains is still remarkable, because Celtic society could accept a woman as a war leader, and Rome found the fact so astonishing it became the story. Boudica raised the Iceni, and the neighboring Trinoventas joined her, a tribe nursing its own wound because the Roman colony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, had been built on their confiscated land, settled by retired legionaries who treated the locals as a labor supply, seizing farms and calling the previous owners slaves. And looming over the town was the grievance made of stone, the great temple of the deified Emperor Claudius, the conqueror himself elevated to a god, whose cult the local British notables were compelled to serve, and, worse, to finance, priesthoods that Tacitus describes as devouring whole fortunes. The Trinoventas were paying for the temple of the man who had dispossessed them. Camulodunum was the first target, and it fell fast. The town had no walls. The colonists had actually leveled parts of the old legionary defenses to make room for houses, so confident was the Roman East. Tacitus records the panic omens that ran through the town in the final days, the Statue of Victory toppling face down as if fleeing, wailing heard in the theater, and when the citizens begged Tacitus Decianus for help, the procurator sent them exactly 200 poorly armed men. Its defenders barricaded themselves inside the Great Temple, the most hated building in Britain, and held out for 2 days before the sanctuary burned over their heads. Archaeologists at Colchester have been cutting through the result for a century, a destruction horizon of burned daub and carbonized goods, in places half a meter thick, including whole shop inventories of imported pottery and even carbonized dates and figs, a town's daily life flash, frozen in ash. A detachment of the 9th Legion, roughly 2,000 infantry under the legate Petilius Cerealis, marched south to relieve the town and was ambushed on the road. Its infantry was effectively wiped out. Cerealis escaped with the cavalry and shut himself inside his fortress. and Catus Dius, the man whose greed had started the fire, looked at what was coming and fled the province entirely, crossing to Gaul and taking himself out of the story. Within weeks, the rebellion had destroyed a Roman city, mauled a Roman legion, and grown with every mile it moved. This is the point where the story stops being about one wronged queen and becomes about the survival of the province. The rebellion was now moving toward the largest, richest, most defenseless settlement in Britain. It was moving toward London. Now shift 250 miles to the northwest, because the man who has to solve this problem is not where the problem is. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, governor of Britain, was on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, off the coast of North Wales, systematically destroying the sacred groves of the Druids. Understand who this man was. Nearly 20 years earlier, campaigning in Mauritania in North Africa, he had become, as far as the record shows, the first Roman commander to take an army across the Atlas Mountains, and the Oxford Classical Dictionary records him as one of the most experienced mountain warfare commanders Rome had. Rome had sent him to Britain precisely because Wales was a mountain problem, and Mona was the endgame, the island that served the Druids as sanctuary, treasury, and refuge for every fighter the Welsh campaigns had displaced. Tacitus paints the assault in one of his most famous scenes. The legionaries momentarily frozen on the shoreline by the sight of the enemy line. Armed men interspersed with black-robed women brandishing torches like furies and druids calling down curses with raised hands, until Suetonius shamed his men forward, the groves were cut down and the altars destroyed. It was the culmination of his governorship, and it could not have been more badly timed. The best troops in the province were with him at the far corner of the island when the east caught fire. What Suetonius did next tells you everything about how his mind worked. He did not wait to concentrate his army. He rode fast down Watling Street with an advance force ahead of his own legions and reached London before Boudica did. And then, having reached it, he made one of the coldest command decisions in Roman history. London, at that moment, was barely a decade old. Founded around the year 47 or 50, not as an official colony but as a boom town, a merchant settlement that had erupted at the lowest convenient bridging point of the Thames, perhaps 10 to 30,000 people, warehouses, traders from across the empire, and not 1 foot of wall. Suetonius looked at it, packed with people begging him to defend it, weighed it against the forces he actually had on hand, and concluded it could not be held. Both a 2018 study of Rome in Londinium and a 2021 history of London in the Roman world reconstruct this moment, and both make the same point. Defending London meant losing the army, and losing the army meant losing the island. Suetonius took anyone who could keep pace with the army and marched back out. Everyone who stayed died, and Tacitus notes who stayed: the old, the sick, and those too attached to the place to leave it. Dio's account of what the rebels did to the captives is grim beyond easy repeating, and some of it is surely atrocity literature, but the totality of the destruction is not in doubt. And here the archaeology speaks, because this is not a claim that rests on Tacitus alone. Excavations across the city of London keep finding it. A horizon of scorched red clay and ash, in places tens of centimeters thick, sealed beneath later Roman rebuilding, turned up at site after site from Gracechurch Street to the excavations at One Poultry, the physical fingerprint of the burning of Londinium in the year 60. Recent archaeological work on the destruction and reconstruction of Londinium treats that layer as one of the clearest catastrophe signatures anywhere in the Roman world. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, was destroyed next, and the target list tells you something about the rebellion's logic, because Verulamium was a municipium, a town of Britons who had taken Roman status, Roman habits, Roman law. Boudica's army was not only fighting the occupier, it was burning out the collaborators, 3 cities gone. Tacitus puts the combined dead at 70,000, another figure to hold loosely, but the burn layers are not rhetoric. They are still there under the streets. While London burned, Suetonius was assembling his instrument. He had the 14th Legion, veterans of the Welsh campaigns, the unit that would carry the reputation of this one day for a generation. He had detachments of the 20th. He had auxiliary infantry and cavalry from the nearest garrisons. Altogether, close to 10,000 men, which is worth pausing on, because it means the force that saved Roman Britain was roughly a quarter of the total Roman military establishment on the island. The rest was dead, besieged, or too far away. He sent orders to the Second Legion Augusta, stationed in the southwest, at the fortress of Isca, modern Exeter, that a 2024 study of Roman Exeter has examined in detail, ordering it to march and join him. Hold that thread. The Second Legion did not come. Its legate happened to be absent, and command had devolved onto the camp prefect, a career soldier named Suetonius Paulinus, third in the chain, a man promoted for administrative reliability suddenly holding a decision far above his station. He looked at the reports, at the annihilated infantry of the 9th, at the hostile tribes between his fortress and the rendezvous, and he refused the order. 10,000 stayed 10,000. Whatever Suetonius planned, he now had to execute it a full legion short. So he chose ground, and this is the heart of the entire episode. We do not know exactly where. Scholars have argued for Manchester near Atherstone, for High Cross where Watling Street meets the Fosse Way, for the valley at Churchstowe in Northamptonshire, and the honest answer is that the field has never been found. But Tacitus describes the position precisely, and a 2021 study of how the ancient sources present this campaign notes that this is one battlefield description scholars take seriously, because every detail is tactically functional rather than decorative. Suetonius drew up his army in a defile, a narrow valley, with dense forest closing off the ground behind him, and an open plain spreading out in front, ground that offered an attacker no cover and no concealed approach. Read that as an engineer would. The woods at his back meant he could not be encircled from behind, and just as important, that his own men could not run. The valley walls on his flanks meant he could not be enveloped from the sides, which is the standard fate of the outnumbered army, and it also solved his arithmetic, because 10,000 men trying to hold an open plain against that host would be stretched into a line 1 or 2 men deep, but 10,000 men across a defile a few hundred meters wide could stand in deep, resilient ranks with reserves behind them. And the open plain in front meant the Britons could only reach him one way, straight ahead, funneled by the narrowing ground into a frontage that Suetonius, not Boudica, had decided the width of 230,000 people, if we humor the Roman count, and the terrain guaranteed that only a few thousand of them could actually fight at any given moment. The rest were not an army. They were an audience pressing forward into the backs of their own front line. Suetonius had not found a battlefield. He had found a machine for deleting a numerical advantage, and he parked his army inside it. To understand what happened when the two sides met, you need to understand what each of them was, because these were not two versions of the same thing. They were two entirely different theories of violence. The British theory was the charge. Celtic warfare, as far as we can reconstruct it, and a study of Celtic warrior iconography in the journal Gladius, traces this through the images the Celts left of themselves was built around the individual warrior. Fighters who displayed courage conspicuously, some traditions fighting nearly unarmored to prove it, lime-washed hair, the blare of the carnix, the tall bronze war horn with its animal-headed bell designed to throw an unearthly braying over the noise of the charge, and chariots racing the front of the line carrying champions to hurl insults and javelins. The signature weapon was the long sword of the Latin tradition, an iron blade often around 3 feet, built for sweeping, slashing blows delivered at a run, with the full rotation of the shoulders behind it. It was a terrifying system, and it had a genuine win condition. If the charge landed, if the noise and mass and violence of that first collision broke the enemy formation open into 1,000 individual duels, the Celtic warrior was in his element, with the room to swing and the numbers to swarm. Every previous British success in this rebellion, Camulodunum, the ambush of the 9th, had been that win condition triggering. But the system had a dependency. A slashing sword needs an arc, several feet of clearance to raise, cock, and deliver the blow. Compress the fight, pack the bodies tight enough, and that blade cannot be brought back for the stroke. The weapon that defines you becomes a metal bar you are holding. The Roman theory was the opposite. It was the deletion of the individual. The legionary carried the scutum, a curved plywood shield the better part of a meter wide with an iron boss that doubled as a punching weapon, 2 weighted javelins, the pila and the gladius, the short sword. The pilum deserves a moment because it was a piece of deliberate engineering, about 2 kilograms of throwing weapon with a long soft iron shank behind a hardened pyramidal point, designed so that on impact the point punched through a shield and the shank bent, meaning it could not be thrown back, and the man whose shield it was stuck in had to either drag the dead weight or drop his protection entirely. The Encyclopedia of the Roman Army describes the gladius as a weapon optimized for the thrust, a 2-foot blade that travels inches rather than feet, straight forward, from behind a wall of shields, into the torso of whoever is pressed against that wall, and Roman training doctrine was explicit that a thrust of a few inches into the body kills where a slash usually wounds. It requires no room. It gets stronger as the fight gets denser, and the Romans had a formation designed to create exactly that density. The cuneus, the wedge, the formation Tacitus says Suetonius's men used on this field. A 2014 reassessment of Roman infantry tactics in the journal Historia argues we should picture such formations not as a parade ground triangle, but as a concentrated aggressive column of attack, a battering ram of shields driving into a crowd at its point of least cohesion and splitting it. Now hold those two systems side by side and look again at Suetonius Valley. He had chosen ground that forced hundreds of thousands of people to compress. Compression was the one condition that neutralized the British weapon and perfected the Roman one. The battlefield was not neutral. The battlefield was a weapon aimed at the Celtic sword. Here is how the day unfolded, stage by stage, as Tacitus tells it. Stage 1, the standoff. The British host filled the plain, and behind it the wagon line was drawn up in its great arc, the families settling in to watch. Boudica, Tacitus says, rode along her line with her daughters in the chariot beside her, and whatever words he later put in her mouth, the message of her presence was plain enough. This was the reckoning for the flogging and everything after it. Dio adds a scene of ritual, Boudica releasing a hair from the folds of her dress and reading its run as an omen, then invoking Andraste, a British goddess of victory whose name survives nowhere else in the record. Suetonius's recorded speech is shorter and colder. Ignore the noise. There are more of them, but fewer of them can fight. Throw the javelins, then close, knock them down with the shield bosses, and do not stop for plunder. It reads less like oratory than like an operations order, which is probably the point. Stage 2, the charge, and the first act of the machine. The Britons came on across the open plain, and the Romans did not move. They stood in their ranks along the defile and let the narrowing ground do its silent work, squeezing that enormous frontage tighter with every 100 yards, packing running warriors into a denser and denser mass. And when the leading edge of that mass reached javelin range, roughly the last 15 to 20 yards, the legionaries threw 10,000 men, 2 pila each, 20,000 javelins delivered in successive volleys, onto a compressed crowd that could not dodge, could not scatter, could not even fall down freely because the press of bodies behind held the dying upright. Thousands of iron points dropping into a target that physics would not allow to miss, and every pilum that struck a shield instead of a body still did its work, its bent shank turning the shield into an anchor and stripping the warrior behind it of his cover for the fight to come. The charge, the single win condition of the entire British system, arrived at the Roman shields as something already staggering, already tangled in its own casualties. Stage 3, the wedge. This is the moment most retellings get backwards. The outnumbered army attacked. On Suetonius's signal, the legions came down out of the defile in wedge formation, shields locked, and drove into the stalled crowd, and now every advantage inverted. The Briton in that crush could not swing his long blade. The legionary needed 6 inches of thrust. The Briton, often unarmored, stood chest to chest with a man and mail behind a shield the size of a door, and the Roman fighting sequence was a closed loop that never opened space. Punch with the boss, thrust below it, step forward onto the fallen, repeat, with fresh ranks rotating into the front as the leading men tired. The front of the British host became a killing surface that could not fight back and could not retreat, because behind it stood 100,000 of its own people, still pushing forward, still feeding the machine. The auxiliaries and cavalry drove in along the flanks of the mass, lances leveled, and the chariots, the mobile aristocratic core of the British way of war, had nowhere left to maneuver and simply disappeared into the crush. The pressure that had been Boudica's greatest asset became the instrument of her army's destruction. Her numbers were now crushing her own warriors against the Roman line. Stage 4. The wall of wagons, and the resolution of our first open loop, the one the Britons built themselves. When the mass finally broke, when the rout began and that enormous host turned to flee, it ran into its own grandstand. The wagon line, the families, the arc of carts positioned for spectacle, now sealed the only exit from the field. The retreating army piled against it and stalked, and the legions kept coming. Tacitus is unsparing here. The soldiers killed everything at the wagon line, the warriors, the women, even the baggage animals, and his phrase for the day is that it equaled the famous victories of old. This is where the arithmetic of the day was written, the 80,000 against the 400, with Tacitus adds, only slightly more Romans wounded than killed. The figure is Roman and it flatters Rome, but the mechanism it describes is fully believable because massacres of this shape are always made in the rout, not the fight. Study any of history's most lopsided fields, Cannae, Agincourt, and you find the same signature. The killing happens after cohesion fails, when the losing side is compressed against an obstacle and can no longer defend itself. Boudica's host had built its own obstacle before the battle began and paid to sit behind it. In one afternoon, the rebellion that had erased 3 cities ceased to exist as a military force. Boudica herself did not long survive the field. Tacitus says she took poison, Dio says illness, and adds that the Britons gave her a rich burial. Either way, within a short time she was gone. Now the second loose thread and the part of the aftermath most retelling skip. Word of the victory reached the Second Legion Augusta in the southwest, the legion that never marched. Its acting commander, Paulinus Paulinus, the man who had refused Suetonius' order and thereby cheated his soldiers of a share in the most celebrated victory in the province's history, fell on his own sword. Tacitus presents it as the required exit for an officer whose caution had curdled into disgrace, and the victor's own ending is stranger still. Suetonius, reinforced with about 7,000 fresh troops from Germany, spent the following months in a punitive campaign of burning and starvation across the rebel territories. And the starvation did much of the work for him, because Tacitus notes the rebels had neglected to sow their fields that year, so confident were they of eating Roman grain. But the province's new financial officer saw where this was heading. Caius Decianus's replacement as procurator was a Gaul named Julius Classicianus, a man of provincial origin himself, and he began reporting to Rome that the governor's vengeance was strangling any hope of recovery and that no end of fighting should be expected while Suetonius held command. Nero sent one of his freedmen, Polyclitus, to investigate, and within about a year Rome found its pretext, the loss of a few ships and their crews on the coast, and quietly replaced Suetonius with the milder Publius Petronius Turpilianus, who let the province breathe. The man who had saved Britain was eased out for the way he behaved after saving it. And history left a physical footnote to the quarrel, because Classicianus died in office in London, and fragments of his tombstone, later reused in the city's walls, were dug out centuries later and now stand in the British Museum. The procurator who curbed the conqueror, resting in the city the conqueror had abandoned. There is even a tradition in the Roman sources that in the darkest weeks of the revolt, the Emperor Nero had weighed abandoning Britain altogether. One afternoon in one valley is the reason that remained a hypothetical. Nero, for his part, knew who had won it, and the 14th Legion carried the honorific Martia Victrix, martial and victorious, from that day forward. And London, the city Suetonius had written off, came back. The archaeological work on the destruction layer shows the settlement rebuilt over its own ash, larger and more deliberately planned than before, on its way to becoming the provincial capital. The red burn horizon under the modern city marks the moment Roman Britain nearly ended, and everything above it exists because of the defile on Watling Street. If you take one idea from this episode, take this one. Boudica did not lose because her cause was weak or her people lacked courage. Camulodunum, the 9th Legion, and London all prove otherwise. She lost because Suetonius understood that a battlefield is not a stage where numbers perform. It is a system of constraints, and whoever sets the constraints decides in advance what the numbers are worth. Forest behind, slopes beside, a narrowing funnel in front. 3 terrain features, chosen by one man, and 200,000 became a crowd that could only reach him a few thousand at a time. The most dangerous general is rarely the one with the biggest army. It is the one who decides where the fight happens. Somewhere along the line of the old road, under farmland the sources never quite let us pinpoint, that valley is still there. If this kind of battlefield engineering is what you come to history for, subscribe to the War Room Files, and a like genuinely helps these longer episodes find the people who want them. I will see you on the next field.